Hello, my name is Barnaby Robson. I play principal clarinet in the orchestra of English National Opera and I teach at the Royal College of Music in London. These are my artist insights with Yamaha. Today we're going to be talking about orchestral auditions. The orchestral audition is quite a unique musical experience, mainly because it lasts for a very short time compared to playing a normal concert. In that time, you've got to show your musical abilities and most importantly, your orchestral skills. The majority of the audition will be taken up with playing very short orchestral excerpts. These can last 15 or 20 seconds. So you really need to concentrate and maximize every second of that audition to show what a great player you are. There are four main areas that you can really think about, which I feel are very important when you're preparing for and when you're in the audition room itself. And those are accuracy, rhythmic stability, musical context, and flexibility. So, of course, with accuracy, we all want to play all the right notes and all the right rhythms all the time, but particularly so when you've only got a 20-second excerpt. If you go wrong in that, you haven't got much time to recover. So, accuracy comes from concentration, and you can practice concentration in the practice room. So, of course, practice the notes. We need to make sure they're absolutely there under our fingers. But put a little bit of pressure on yourself in the practice room. So you might want to, for example, play an extract through 4 or 5 times and see if you can nail it every single time. If you can't, go back to time number 1 and start again. You can record yourself and video yourself. That feels more like a performance than just playing it through. And another trick, you could nip outside the practice room and just walk up and down the corridor quickly a couple of times. That will get your heart rate and your breathing going. Then come back into the practice room and try and play a few excerpts through again. And you'll find that that feels much more like the sort of adrenaline you feel when you walk into an audition. Okay, so then the second thing, rhythmic stability. Of course, absolutely vital in the orchestral situation. You're one player in 50 or 100 players. So when you start to play that extract in the audition, the panel are going to take the tempo that you give them and they're going to be counting along, making sure that you're sticking to that tempo, unless the music, of course, tells you to do a riton or cello-rando. So that's very, very important. They want to know that you're a rhythmic player. And then musical context, absolutely vital when preparing orchestral excerpts. You need to know what happens before, what happens during, and what happens after that solo. So if it's an extract you've never seen before, rather than just getting the clarinet out and having a play through, first thing, look at the score. Go online, listen to some recordings, a variety of recordings. If it's a Beethoven symphony, for instance, you could try listening to some original instrument performances as well as some more old-style romantic performances. So that's very, very important. You must understand how you fit into that large orchestral instrument, the symphonic orchestral instrument that we're part of. And then finally, flexibility. Again, really, really important. So you may have an idea of how you want the solo to go, but that might not be the same idea as the conductor does. So you want to be able to prepare these excerpts with one way that you're going to present it in the audition, but of course be prepared that you might be asked to play it differently, you might be asked to play it a bit faster or a bit slower. That's a great sign if you are, because it means that the panel are interested in your playing and they want to see whether you can be flexible. In the orchestral situation, the conductor might ask for something, and as a player you've got to be able to respond and instantly change something. You probably don't have the time to go home, think about how you're going to change your technique to accommodate that, and then come back the next day and try it again. It's something that needs to happen really quite instantly. So flexibility is a great skill to have as an orchestral player. Of course, you need to be accurate, you need to be rhythmic, you need to understand the musical context of all these excerpts, but you also need to be flexible. So let's look at Beethoven's 6th Symphony now, the Pastoral Symphony. The 2 solos that we're going to look at come up on virtually every orchestral audition list I've ever seen. So there must be a good reason for that. When we look at the first solo, it really does encompass all of the things we've just talked about: accuracy, rhythmic stability, musical context, and flexibility. So with flexibility, this solo can go at a variety of speeds. You'll discover that as soon as you go and listen to some recordings. It can go really anywhere between about 116 and 108. That's not a great deal on the metronome, but it means a lot to us because it changes the speed of those triplets and therefore where we breathe and perhaps even the sort of articulation we decide to use. So practicing this solo at different speeds is absolutely vital. If we get stuck into one speed, our breathing gets stuck into only being able to do in certain places, and then if we're asked to change that, we may have some problems. The other tricky thing, there's a diminuendo that Beethoven writes, but he doesn't write a writ. So we mustn't slow down when we do the diminuendo. We hand over to the first violins. We need to make sure, unless the conductor says otherwise, that we do that without slowing down. Technically, we've got that D and G interval from the top D to the G. And that's tricky, even more so when we're trying to get quieter, because the chances are that if we overcook the diminuendo, those notes won't speak. So there's a couple of ways to practice this. Looking at the beginning of the extract, we must remember that the bassoon is playing quavers with us through those first 3 bars. So we mustn't rush at all there in our anticipation of getting to the triplets. We need to make sure that we're steady and that we're listening to the bassoon. Now, in terms of the middle section of the solo, where we've got the triplet passage, and we've also got to think about rights and lefts, a good tip is to play this through legato with the metronome on, because you may think that you've got an issue with articulation here, but actually it's finger coordination. So play it through with the metronome on, legato, and then add the tonguing in. Your fingers coordination may be absolutely fine, but it's worth checking. The dynamics that are marked in the clarinet part are the same as those that are marked in the score. He writes dolce, but he doesn't write piano. The big orchestral sound that we have in the forte just before our dolce in the clarinet part, I think if we drop down too much, the temptation is that the clarinet disappears a little bit and we're struggling to hear it. So I would play the dolce, but keep the sound. So with the diminuendo at the end, the difficulty, as I said, is making sure that the notes all come out when we want to create the diminuendo. So a good way to practice this is just to loop those last 4 or 5 bars a couple of times, so that you practice playing much longer than the solo is actually written for, making your diminuendo, make an extreme diminuendo, so that when you then come to do the solo and it's only 4 or 5 bars long, that will feel a lot easier. So you could practice something like this. Right down until the point where the notes start not speaking, and there you know where roughly that's going to happen. So we don't want to get anywhere close to that. The other thing to do is to keep the D and the G, if you like, in a sort of separate box in your mind away from the rest of the arpeggio, so that you always think of those 2 notes as being slightly separate and slightly louder than the rest of the group, so that we're secure that those notes are going to come out. We don't want musically it to sound like that, but technically we might want to work on it like that. So you could practice. Always making sure those 2 notes are louder. The other thing that might help is if you think of a slight crescendo between the D and the G, so that this is not something that we want musically to happen, but technically we want to make sure there's enough air connecting those 2 notes. The D is quite an open note with lots of fast air. The G is a slightly more resistant note, so we want to give a little bit more air between those 2 notes. So I'll now play through the solo from the first movement. So now moving on to the second movement clarinet solo. This is a really beautiful solo, it comes right in the middle of the movement. With this excerpt, you need to be really thinking about counting the rests. It sounds obvious, but from the way you play your first entry, everyone in the audition room will be listening to see that you're aware of what's going on in your rests. And that comes back to musical context. So the second violins and the cellos are playing semiquavers the whole way through at the beginning here. So you really need to be hearing those. So just be thinking about those semiquavers going on while you're playing your solo. One technique is to extend the crotchet so that you just hold that on while you're thinking of the semiquavers into the next group of semiquavers as a practice technique, just so you get more of a sense of how that gap feels, if you like. And then we've got this beautiful arpeggio passage at the end of the solo with a crescendo and then a piano on the last bar of the solo. So I like to feel that each section of that arpeggio is a notch louder than the last, so that we really make sure that that crescendo happens, and it happens in a big way. That also gives us a little bit of leeway technically, because again we've got a top D to deal with. So if we start the arpeggio in the final bar too soft and then try and get softer, we may be in danger of that top D not speaking. So if you can end the arpeggio that's written with the crescendo really quite big, that gives you a little bit more room dynamically to start that last bar arpeggio at perhaps mezzo piano and then come away during it so that your top D is going to be secure. And then you've got to think about the quavers before the trill. Again, looking at the score and thinking about musical context here. The double basses come in on pizzicato just before your last two quavers before the trill. So we need to accommodate and give a little bit of room. That's also a place where we can take a breath. And like the first movement, again, you're going to need to practice it at a variety of tempi. So you can even, if you've got a metronome that goes fast enough, drive yourself mad and put it on in semiquavers. So that's roughly around 300, I think. So it's not the nicest feeling to play with, but it gives you a real sense of where you're slowing and where you're speeding up. But somewhere between 144 and 152, I feel is a sensible approach. That's at 144. So I think really you need to think about breathing early in the rests, actually, because it's very, the temptation is to just be thinking about those string textures during the rests and forget to breathe. So I think breathing a little bit early and actually getting the air going so that none of the they are, of course, upbeats, aren't they, to the next bar line. So we don't want to get too stuck on them. I think we need to play through them and into the next bar line each time. And similarly, the crescendo is not marked until the arpeggio. So when we get to this section, of course, we want to enjoy that beautiful writing that Beethoven gives us, but we don't want to crescendo all the way through those two bars. So in a way, we want to release the shorter notes and just enjoy playing through the two big beats in the bar, the C and the F each time. And then with the arpeggio, Perhaps we could help ourselves a little bit. We could start in the quieter dynamic a little bit shorter and then play longer through the arpeggio, perhaps. And this is where the pizzicato comes in. So it may not be as long as that, of course. It just depends, but awareness is key there. And also, I think that it's important we keep the energy going through the trill. I've heard it in auditions where somebody's played a beautiful solo and then it's all gone rather flat at the end in terms of energy because we just haven't had enough air left, probably, is what it is for the trill. So breathing wise, we need to be constantly making sure that we have enough. We need to take a very, very big breath, a beat or so before that arpeggio starts. So if I play from here, so a really, really big one there, so that you can play all the way through, and your next breath will just be a little one that you can sneak in there where the pizzicato comes in. So those are the two extracts from Beethoven's Sixth Symphony, the Pastoral Symphony.